Unless we take on bad leadership, it's almost certain to get worse. The longer bad is able to take root, rather like a plant, the digger those roots go and the harder it becomes to uproot them. Assess your costs and your benefits. Don't be dumb. Even if you want to upend bad, however defined, be careful, be aware of your own self-interest. Do you really need the job, or is your talent sought elsewhere? And are you willing to lose your job over your intervention or over your action?
That's Dr. Barbara Kellerman. She's the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she also teaches. Global Gurus ranked her among the world's top 30 management professionals year after year. She's also an award-winning speaker and author-editor of many books. And today, she's sharing some wisdom from her latest, Leadership from Bad to Worse, What Happens When Bad Festers. So you'll learn 1, where leadership training falls short, 2 core components of bad leadership, and 3, 4 tips for standing up to bad leaders. I'm Pete Mockaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Barbara. Barbara, welcome.
Well, thank you, Pete. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Well, I'm excited to dig into your wisdom, and I thought it'd be great if you could maybe kick us off with hearing a tale of maybe the most wild case of bad leadership you have witnessed or heard about through your work and research in the workplace.
Well, Pete, if you know my work, it goes back on bad leadership in particular to a book I wrote or an essay. First, there was an essay I wrote called Hitler's Ghost, a manifesto, which was me arguing that what I call the leadership industry, which is my field, all kinds of experts on leadership, whether in corporate leadership or political leadership, mainly corporate leadership, that my colleagues in the leadership industry were not paying any attention to what I call the dark side of leadership, the painful side of leadership, the egregious side of leadership. So that was my essay called Hitler's Ghost. But in the book that grew out of that, which came out about 20 years ago, which is called Bad Leadership, What It Is, How It Happens, Why It Matters, I developed 7 different types of bad leadership. Those types of bad leadership are important because they range from the ineffectual all the way in awfulness to evil. So it really depends on which type of bad leadership are we talking about. Obviously, if we're talking about evil leadership, which I define as someone who inflicts pain, literally physical or psychological pain on his or her followers, that's obviously a different case in point as somebody who is, dare I say, simply ineffectual.
Well, yeah. So I guess I'm interested in terms of, let's go with evil. In terms of in the workplace, you say, whoa. So you think your boss is bad? Check it. This is what full-blown bad looks like.
So I would say that the word evil, as I define it, and again, as I developed and identify the types in the book, it very rarely applies to the workplace because it implies a kind of malevolent intent, which I don't think we find that often in the workplace. In the workplace, I talk more about something called callous leadership, leaders who are thoughtless, mean, or unkind, not thinking carefully about the other, or leaders who are explosive, who lose their tempers too quickly. So again, it depends on the situation, but there are different types of bad leaders that are found in the workplace, alas. It's one of the mysteries of the human condition to me, because it would seem to me that it would be in the interest of most leaders and managers to keep those who report to them relatively happy as opposed to unhappy.
I've often wondered, that's one of my top mysteries of humanity, is like, even if you are purely self-interested and truly care not a whit about your fellow human being, you're still better off not being a jerk. You get farther, you achieve more of your ends if people can tolerate you and generally are fine interacting with you.
I completely agree with you, Pete. But I would say it especially applies to, let's say, the United States of America in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, when the issue of talent retention, holding on to people that you think are really important to your enterprise, to your mission, to your purpose, that becomes really top of your list of priorities. So it is often in one's self-interest, apart from the graciousness of being decent as opposed to indecent to other people. It is in one's, as you imply, in one's self-interest, in the corporate interest, and almost always in the interest of the task that needs to be accomplished to keep people, if not wildly happy, at least from being miserably unhappy.
That checks out. So with all that said, can you lay it on us, a tale that was particularly shocking in terms of bad leadership at work?
I think I'm going to take a slightly different example, a man, because he's so extremely well-known even since, though he's now dead, a man by the name of Jack Welch.
All right.
Who, of course, was one of the legendary corporate leaders of all time. The company, which many of your listeners will know, is General Electric. And it's an example. I would not exactly call him a bad leader, particularly a prototype of somebody who's awful, but he was known, very well known, and much admired for being lean and mean. And that, of course, meant letting a lot of people go.
I remember the nickname Neutron Jack.
Yes,
he would
exactly.
evaporate make the people disappear, but keep the buildings and equipment.
Exactly. But I will tell you why I, in particular, think that history has proven him not to be a particularly good leader, even setting aside the point that we're just making. So Jack Welch was on the cutting edge of what I referred to earlier as the leadership industry. And you probably know this, Pete, that GE, again, was on the cutting edge of corporate training. They had a campus in Crotonville, New York, and it was well known, again, at the forefront of the leadership industry. The irony of that, though, and it addresses what I am known for, I dare say, for better and worse, which is a kind of skepticism, if not even cynicism, about the leadership industry, which professes to teach people how to lead wisely and well. And I'm not sure we have an enormous amount of evidence for that. But setting that aside for the moment, the Crotonville campus was an example of something that didn't work. Because as I hardly have to tell you that in recent decades, now it's somewhat recovered under CEO Larry Culp, but for decades, General Electric went from being the icon of American industry to being one of the fall guys of American industry. And Jack Welch's successor failed absolutely to not only help the company thrive, but he succeeded in plunging it straight downhill.
And there, what do you believe are some of the particular behaviors that were so destructive and may have led to GE's demise?
I don't know that I would use that language, Pete, that it was particular behaviors. I think it was just a kind of hubris that assumed that the way I teach leadership, it's guarantees to succeed. As I suggested a moment ago, we have not a great deal of evidence that the way leadership is taught, whether within organizations, whether within business schools, schools of public administration, our criteria for measurement are rather meager. We're dealing here with human beings, not widgets. So it's hard to measure the success of a leadership program, a leadership course, a leadership institute. And I would say that hubris was the main problem with Jack Welch and his leadership, his legendary leadership training efforts.
All right. And so then could you maybe give us some examples of how hubris translates into some of the things they did and said that were problematic?
Well, again, I want to be careful to distinguish between being bad, which is, or to use the word you just used, problematic, and not being good enough. In other words, I'm not saying that what was done at Crotonville was bad. I'm saying that the successes that were touted were in scant evidence and are in scant evidence. And I've taught many leadership courses, although I don't tell people I teach how to lead, I tell them I teach about leadership, which is actually two different things. That when somebody takes a leadership course, whether mine or anybody else's, and then they're questioned at the end, or there was a kind of review, what did you learn? How was it? Typically, the answer is, this was a great course. I learned so much. It's amazing. I'm a different person. But in fact, in the real world, we don't really have brilliantly successful ways of assessing the long-term impact of what most leadership courses, programs, centers, institutes, etc., actually accomplish. So it's a quick and easy sell. Buy my book and you too can learn how to lead. Take my course and you too can learn how to lead better than you're leading now. Follow my 7 easy steps and you too can succeed. I would argue that's not as brilliant to sell and brilliant to buy as people generally like to believe.
Okay. So then I'm curious, from your perspective, having looked at a lot of things and having a lot of skepticism for a lot of promises, have you seen any bright spots and what makes them bright?
In a book I wrote called Professionalizing Leadership, I argued that leadership learning should much, much more strongly than it currently does resemble learning how to be a physician, learning how to be a lawyer, learning how to be a teacher, learning how to be an engineer. In other words, I argue that we need to take it more seriously, that we need to think more like some of the sages from the past, whether it's Plato or Confucius or Machiavelli, which is it takes a long time, if not a lifetime, to learn how to lead. And if you're going to, again, emulate what the professions do, becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, you will realize that what I break down into a 3-step process. First, it should be, in my view, leadership education, which is developing an intellectual understanding of what leadership and followership entail. Just like in medical school, one of the first courses that you take is anatomy. They're not going to let you slice into a human body until you have been educated about the anatomy of the human body. So it is with leadership. I believe first step should be leadership education. Second step should be what I call leadership training, which is where you develop the skills required to lead in your particular context. By the way, I'm going to deviate again because I want to stop at context. So I can be a great leader in one situation, but a lousy leader in another. So I always talk about the importance of context, which is something we can return to if you like. But I'll back for a minute just to the 3-step process of what I call professionalizing leadership. Step 1, leadership education. Step 2, leadership training, learning the skills and talents that are required for your particular job or task in your particular organization or situation or circumstance. And step 3 is what I call leadership development, which is like adult development, which means, again, lifelong learning. You cannot get an MD in 2024 and presume that that medical degree, no matter how great the medical school, will stand you in good stead 5, 10, not to speak of 15 and 20 years hence. If you're a physician or you're a lawyer, you must take continuing education courses. You must take courses that keep bringing you up to date on what good medicine and good science entails. And so it should be with leadership. There is no reason to assume that if I take a leadership course or a leadership training or a leadership program in 2024, there will be nothing new to learn in 2029, not to speak of 2034.
Okay. Well, so then digging into your book, Leadership from Bad to Worse, What Happens When Bad Festers, tell me any particularly striking or surprising or counterintuitive discoveries you made here.
I would say they're all surprising and counterintuitive, which is to say that our tendency, and this is the human condition, again, we're not talking here widgets, we're talking about human beings, which complicates the situation infinitely. The surprising thing is how passive we are when we have a bad leader or manager. Now, again, let me go back, because on one level, it is not surprising. Sometimes it is costly and sometimes it is risky to take on a superior. Let's say we're talking in the workplace, to take on a manager or a leader, whatever language we want to use. And it's much easier for us to simply, even though we may dislike it or even become stressed out about it, which is not uncommon in the workplace, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, sometimes we just decide to put up with it, that it's easier to put up with it than to try to figure out how to take it on. The problem with that, as the title Leadership from Bad to Worse implies, unless we take on bad leadership, again, however defined, many different ways, relatively early in the process, it's almost certain to get worse. In other words, bad leaders, probably like bad people more generally, don't wake up one fine morning and say, golly gee, I've been bad. I've been not nice to my subordinates. I really ought to be a nicer boss. I ought to pay more attention to their well-being. I ought to care more about how they feel on the job. Silly me, I've not been behaving very well. What that means is that the only way then to get these people to change is in some way to intrude on, interrupt the process. Sometimes that's an exogenous force, something that happens from the outside. But more often than not, it is unfortunately the subordinates that need to take on the issue and need to think through, if there's going to be any change for the positive, how can this be done tactically and strategically in a way where I don't end up cutting my own head off, that is, cutting off my nose to spite my face. So I would say the issue of the reluctance to look at bad leadership and try to figure out how to stop it from getting worse, that to me is on one level surprising, although, again, I hasten to add, on another level, really quite understandable.
Oh, Barbara, this is fascinating. So many things are sparking up for me here in my brain. One is the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall, in which he sings the song, "Someone should do something."
Exactly.
It's that passive sense. It's like, I don't like this. It's very uncomfortable. It's risky. I hope something changes. But often, to your point, it just doesn't. And I'm thinking, you might get a kick out of this example. We had a senior executive at I don't want to name names here, a major organization that teaches leadership, Barbara. And there was another senior executive who I guess went through a startling number of assistants, maybe 6, very quickly. And they were getting the recruiters, the headhunters fired up to hire a 7th. And then before they did so, it was a peer. A fellow executive said, hey, and so he sort of demonstrated like how to give this feedback well. It's like, hey, I want you to understand my intention is only to serve you and to help you out here. I've noticed that 6 people have left, and there's been a lot of sort of comments or themes associated how your behaviors it has been perceived as pretty disrespectful and demeaning. And so, boom, there it is. And sure enough, like that's hard to say. And nobody did.
And you're talking about peer to peer. You're not even talking about subordinate to superior.
Exactly. It was peer to peer, but that's what it took. It took someone to sort of shake him up, to provoke the status quo. And sure enough, it worked. At first, he was very upset, but then he took the feedback to heart and said, okay, I guess I can kind of see your perspective, and I guess I will behave differently. And they had a good outcome, so that's really cool. So yes, it does take something. And I think often if there's not a brave someone somewhere, it will just continue. What's that famous quote? The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for the good people to do nothing. Edmund Burke.
Yeah, that is a famous quote, and it's very much what I believe to be true, although I'm always very careful, Pete, as I suggested a minute ago, to not blame I don't want to blame the victim. I don't want to blame the subordinate, because often people need and want to hold on to their jobs. Often people are really quite scared of doing that. It is, of course, as your example suggested, easier if it's a peer as opposed to a subordinate. But in the book, Leadership from Bad to Worse, I have examples of exactly that, including in the corporate sector, how unless it is stopped, it almost does get worse. And one other comment on that is it's much easier to stop it early in the process. When you start noticing somebody is not behaving well, however we want to define that, it is easier to say something, to do something earlier on. The longer bad is able to take root, rather like a plant, the digger those roots go and the harder it becomes to uproot them. So without taking the plant analogy too far, I think you get the point that the longer this goes on and the more entrenched everybody becomes, the more difficult and indeed sometimes often painful it is to upend what's going wrong, to change it.
Certainly. And it just makes the conversation itself harder. Like, why didn't you, how long has this been going on? Why didn't you say anything earlier?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
tricky.
By the way, if I can make it add one other thing here, Pete, I mentioned in passing earlier that my interest in leadership is matched every bit by my interest in followership. So what do I mean when I use the word follower? As you may know, if you're in the leadership field, and your listeners will know who are familiar with the leadership literature, that's a kind of loaded word, follower, because it presumes, among other things, that followers always follow, which is not actually how I define the word. Followers, most of us, by the way, generally follow. We are socialized to follow. We're rewarded by our parents, by our teachers, by our bosses. If we're good followers, meaning relatively obedient most of the time, again, at home, in school, in the workplace, if we disobey too much of the time, that's not good. But in order to understand the leadership dynamic, the dynamics of power and the dynamics of authority and the dynamics of influence, it is impossible to understand them if you focus only on one half of the dyad. You cannot have a leader without at least one follower. And I have argued now strenuously for several decades that therefore the understanding of what happens, let's say, in the workplace, it is impossible to get it by looking only at the person or persons at or near the top of the hierarchy. It is important, equally important, to understand why everybody else is in the workplace is behaving the way they do.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. That makes sense. You mentioned tactically, strategically responding. I definitely want to spend some time on that. But first, maybe you could clue us into what are some of the telltale signs we should look out for? Like what's truly bad versus something I just kind of don't like and doesn't jive with my personal preferences?
The word bad, Pete, is inordinately interesting. So it's childlike, right? You're being bad, says a parent to a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Conversely, oh, what a good little boy or what a good little girl. So when I wrote the book Bad Leadership, I wrestled with that. How do I define bad? What does that mean to be bad? Is there a better word in the English language than bad? And I decided, you earlier used the word, for example, toxic. Well, not all bad leadership is toxic. There's a lot of bad leadership. Toxic, of course, means poisonous. There's a lot of bad leadership that is not poisonous. It's just bad. But it's not so bad that it is toxic. And I was interested, and I remain interested, in what I call the universe of bad leadership. All kinds of bad. Little bit bad, a lot bad, evil bad, as I said earlier, but not so bad too. So I not only developed the 7 different types of bad leadership to which I referred earlier, but I also defined bad, or bad to good, if you will, along 2 axes. And these axes have stood, dare I say, the test of time. There are 2 of them. You can think of them as intersecting if you want. So one axis is from effective leadership, which is, needless to say, good leadership, to ineffective leadership, which is, needless to say, bad leadership. It's better to be effective than it is to be ineffective. The other axis, again, very simple, but simple is good when we're talking about such complicated subjects. The other axis, the second axis, is not effective to ineffective. It is ethical to unethical. So a leader is presumably better if he or she is ethical than if he or she is unethical. Now, to go to your question, since I've defined these as 2 different axes, one is ethical to unethical, the other one is effective to ineffective, you can even understand intuitively that one can be along a continuum. So sometimes really very ethical, but sometimes, and this is, again, the human condition, not uncommon. For example, lying. We generally think that lying isn't so great, but we have a higher tolerance for lying now than we did. And most leaders lie a little bit. Some leaders lie a lot, and people don't seem to mind necessarily. But that's what I mean about 2 core components of being bad, being good. One, again, ethical to unethical. The other, again, effective to ineffective.
Okay, certainly. Well, so then in a way that can surface things pretty clearly. Like, this guy who's really a jerk, and screams and, pounds his fists a lot, is kind of getting some results in terms of folks hop to and do what he says and do what he says quickly and work long hours and make stuff happen. So in a way that's effective, at least short term, but it doesn't feel ethical in terms of dignity and respect and kindness and the golden rule sorts of things. And so that's kind of handy. Is like, are we generating results, effective, ineffective? And does this seem to violate the world's wisdom traditions about the dignity of the human person and treating others the way you want to be treated? That's more on the ethical, unethical side of things.
Yeah, I cannot support your point enough, Pete. Muddling those two criteria for being bad or good is a big mistake for just the reason that you say. It is really possible. I mean, lots of people didn't like working for Steve Jobs. He wasn't adorable. He wasn't always nice to people who worked for him, but he was, as you say, incredibly effective, brilliantly effective, a genius at being effective as a leader. By the way, this lesson was taught to me very early in my career as a so-called expert in leadership. When I was giving a talk, I was still a young scholar, and I said something about Hitler being a bad leader, which I thought was self-evident. But I remember to this day, somebody standing up in the audience and objecting to what I said for exactly the reason that you just said. That person pointed out, and I've learned my lesson since then, that, again, I'm not assuming your audiences are not experts on German history, but the truth about Adolf Hitler is that between 1933, when he first came to power, and 1939, when the Nazis marched into Poland, he was a brilliantly effective leader. He was an extremely good leader between 33 and 39. If you define good, again, to the point that you just made, Pete, if you define good as being effective, he was a good leader between 1933 and 1939. Not ethical, but very, very effective.
Okay, so that's a handy framework we got there in terms of what kind of bad am I looking at? And so let's say we see on either side, yep, we got an ineffective leader here, or yep, we have an unethical leader here. What are some of the strategic or tactical steps we should take if we find ourselves in that position?
So one of the reasons I'm interested in followership is because of what in the 60s and 70s, a phrase particularly associated with the women's movement, was called consciousness raising. Raising our consciousness about the possibilities, in this case, of action. So those of us who are employees or subordinates or ordinary people working in a group or large organization, whatever it may be, tend not to be aware of the possibilities that we might actually be able to act in an effective way, be agents of action. So if you talk about strategy, it's one of the reasons I'm so big on followership. It's one of the reasons I would wish in a perfect world that good followership, how to be a good follower, would be taught every bit as much as how to be a good leader, because ordinary people need to understand their own agency. If we don't get the fact that we may not have power and we may not have authority, and by the way, I distinguish, as some of you, your audience may have picked up, I distinguish among power is one resource, authority is another resource, influence is the third. So I distinguish among power, authority, and influence. So ordinary people, that is workers at a large organization, or even in a smaller group, subordinates, whatever you want to call them, may not overtly have much power or overtly have much authority. But that doesn't mean that they need to think of that. We need to think of ourselves as being without agency. So consciousness raising about the power, you can call it follower power if you want. That to me is step one.
Beautiful. Okay. So once we have that awareness, what are some of the best possible moves?
Well, I'm always leery of putting people in bad situations. Whistleblowing, for example, has rather a romantic note to it. Oh my God, so-and-so's a whistleblower. How great is that? They opened a can of worms at work and it deserved to be opened. Thank goodness somebody had the courage to do that. In fact, in real life, it's quite dangerous to be a whistleblower. There are books on if you're going to be a whistleblower, you want to be a whistleblower, you better know the law. You better be sure of the financial resources you have because your agent, your organization, your company might sue you. So be careful. So step one is to be careful. Step two is, in general, do not act alone if you can possibly help it. Step three is to start at the lowest level of action. So, to use an example that you used a few moments ago, you said one peer came up to another peer, one boss to another boss, one manager to another manager, and said, you've lost 6 assistants in the last whatever, let's say it's 12 months. You might want to take a look at how your assistants are feeling about being your assistants, about your attitudes and behaviors toward them. So again, how do I do this at the lowest level, which would be presumably a simple conversation, possibly between the subordinate and the superior, friendly, cordial, trying to raise issues that have perhaps nobody's raised before, or to do it in a way that the superior can actually hear. Step 4, 5, and 6 is at certain points, you have a choice. Are you willing to risk your position, possibly even your job? Assess your costs and your benefits. Don't be dumb. Even if you want to upend bad, however defined, be careful, be aware of your own self-interest. Do you really need the job, or is your talent sought elsewhere? And are you willing to lose your job over your intervention or over your action? If you are not, you better assess your risks. You better be careful. But again, if at all possible, do not act alone, get allies, and consider tactically what your various venues are for possibly saying something and doing something. And that could include everything from several of you going to the person who is not acting the way you wish, to going around the person, possibly to a peer, possibly to a superior. So there are all kinds of ways of doing it, but I never, ever want to make it sound simple. And I never, ever want to put people at risk professionally if, in fact, they can't afford, literally or figuratively, to be at risk.
All right. Barbara, tell me, anything else you want to make sure to mention before we hear about some of your favorite things?
Well, I guess the last thing I'll say, Pete, is that although our conversation has focused on the workplace, the work I do, I think of it as transsectoral. It applies as much to the public sector as to the private sector. It applies as much to Western Europe as it does to the United States. And in fact, what's interesting about our field, if I can assume in my camp of being interested in these issues of leadership, is that for all the differences between, let's say, Americans and Argentinians, or Americans even and Canadians, there are profound similarities in the human condition. In the end, we're all human beings. We all relate to power and authority and influence in similar ways. And that's where worth bearing in mind as we focus on the differences among us. It is in this field, perhaps the similarities that are the most striking.
Big thanks to Barbara for sharing her wisdom with us. And big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is Harvard Business Review. This brilliant magazine, published at hbr.org, is the leading destination for smart management thinking. Fun fact, the Harvard Business Review has been mentioned in 108 episodes of the show. That's because HBR has so much great stuff, it just comes up all the time. They got explainer videos, podcasts, real-world case studies, and a whole lot more. I think of HBR each night that I put on my special orange sleepy glasses. Their article, Will Blue Light Glasses Improve Your Sleep?, revealed that those who wore them reported better sleep and a 7% improvement in work performance as compared to those who wore the sham glasses. So I cite HBR anytime anyone tells me that I look silly wearing them. Much of HBR is free when you sign up for a free subscription on their site, but to get unlimited content, that's $10 a month. If you visit hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME, you save 10% off of that subscription. Again, to save 10% off of your HBR subscription, go to hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME. All right. And a favorite book?
One of the courses I taught at Harvard's Kennedy School, and it's arguably my favorite, is a course called Leadership Literacy. So there is a great literature on leadership where people have thought about these issues since time immemorial. I earlier mentioned the names of Confucius and Plato, But if you simply go to some of our own, and by that I mean American founding documents, such as the Federalist Papers, men like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, these men thought long and hard about the issues that you and I are surfacing. So one could do worse than to go back to some of the classics of what I call the great leadership literature, of which I've just given you a small sample.
All right. And is there a key nugget you share that really seems to connect and resonate with folks? You hear yourself quoted back to you often?
I hear that people are happy to have me surface subjects such as bad and follower. Those are the ways, as I said earlier, that I distinguish myself most from my colleagues. And people are relieved to hear a discussion, an honest discussion of how to tackle bad. Again, however bad is defined. People are relieved, eager to hear about their own possibilities for exercising influence, even in large organizations.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
I'm available on email. I have a website, and I am, by the way, a regular blogger. I'm also on LinkedIn, so happy to connect to members of your audience. And I can be found easily if somebody looks hard enough. And I have many, many books on leadership and followership. They're mostly available, of course, on Amazon. So if people are more interested, I'm sure they can find both me and my work.
All right. And you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Become aware of your own potential influence on the people and on the situation within which you find yourself. And becoming contextually conscious of your own role. It is amazing. It is amazing how that empowers people to act.
Barbara, thank you. I wish you many pleasant encounters with good leaders.
Or effective ones with bad leaders, right? Either one or the other.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Pete. Good to talk to you.
I really appreciated Barbara's distinction that a bad leader can be one who is unethical or one who is ineffective. And so I'm looking forward to having conversations with folks in terms of the next time saying, oh my gosh, my boss sucks. It's like, oh, did your boss suck because he's evil or because he's ineffective? And I think sometimes there might just be a third option. Oh, he just really gets on my nerves. I guess he's not super evil or ineffective, but we don't seem to be jiving in terms of our preferences, our relationship, our work styles. Oh, well, I guess it could be worse. So I guess that's good news, but often a handy thought framework helps you dig into what are we really looking at here? And then what's a more appropriate intervention or means of approaching it? Because addressing someone who's evil is very different than addressing someone who's ineffective. Big thanks to Barbara for sharing her wisdom with us. If you want to get a summary write-up of that actionable goodness that she shared, you can sign up for the Gold Nuggets at awesomeatyourjob.com or visit awesomeatyourjob.com/EP977 for the transcript, show notes, and more associated with this episode. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.